Shobit is with JLL, and he's come from India. A lot of experience in the real estate space. So I thought it would be good to have someone who is the general counsel who manages 4 REITs which are listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange, Kwong Weng. Shobit, who comes with a wealth of experience on the capital market side with JLL, and of course the experts, quote unquote, from NDA. So maybe I will just quickly start by saying that many of you may have heard that India has recently introduced a real estate investment trust regime. This has been in the works for a few years, but the new regulations that SEBI has announced have come into force. And as a law firm, we've started getting questions now from our clients as to how does one structure a real estate investment trust. It's very new for India, and it's very new to India, but it's a very exciting opportunity for the whole real estate ecosystem. So maybe if I could quickly start by asking Ruchir a question. Ruchir, you've been doing a lot of, you've been giving a lot of advice, and I know you're working on probably one of the first REITs that is going to be set up in India. So can you give us a very quick background of how these regulations have evolved and what we are seeing today?
Sure. I think just for everyone's benefit, there is a paper which is kept on that table there, which sets out our analysis of the draft REIT regulations. You can pick it up from there now or later for an understanding. I think these draft REIT regulations are the third attempt by SEBI to launch a REIT regime. SEBI first came out with draft REIT regulations in 2008, which never took off. Then it came out with real estate mutual fund regulations with some prohibitive requirements like a daily NAV, which you could probably never do in real estate, or encumbrance-free property, litigation-free kind of property kind of requirements. And that regime also never took off. Even though the regime exists, no one registered as a real estate for a real estate mutual fund. And I think there was a lot of pressure on SEBI and the MOF this time to come up with a very effective REIT regime. The reasons or the driver from SEBI perspective were several. I think one of the major reasons for SEBI has been the protection of the retail investors. Today, Indians, by mindset, at least 2-3 things are very essential, right? One is investment in gold, second investment in real estate, probably third is marriage, So that is a priority that real estate takes in India. So you have to have real estate, and Indians would invest, and there were various kind of schemes which were coming out. You put in 20% now, 80% later, you get this asset, that asset, and the retail investor was not getting enough protection while he wanted exposure to real estate. So I think from SEBI's perspective, the primary driver was retail investor protection and giving them what we call as an asset-backed investment opportunity with established revenue streams. Because if you even invest in a listed company, there is no established revenue stream. The company may upstream dividends, may not upstream dividends. So in a REIT, you get to own the real estate asset, benefit from capital appreciation, yield by putting in a small amount, just as little as 2 lakhs in this, and be assured that whatever revenues come will always be upstream. So 90% of revenues of the REIT will have to be upstreamed. Another larger picture that came up before SEBI was that more and more Indian asset-heavy companies were listing in Singapore. So it may turn out sooner that for listing Indian real estate, India may not be a good market, and Singapore may be a better market. In fact, that's a debate which still continues, that who values Indian real estate better. In fact, Shobit can probably elaborate on that, and many people still feel that probably Singaporeans would value Indian real estate better than what Indians would. And we had an apprehension that we might be exporting our capital markets to Singapore. Just like for software, no one looks at India. If it's software, you would think of NASDAQ or NYSE, right? So there was a fear of exporting Indian capital markets offshore. I think that was another macro picture. Third, core assets, unlike residential assets in India, which are always bought and sold, right, and are self-liquidating in nature, there is core assets have lease rentals. And the question is that Indian market is probably now matured enough, and developers also need an exit. You build up a shopping mall, it's huge. Strata sale is probably not the way to exit. You need some guy who's coming in and buying it from you. Today, for the players like Blackstone, etc., who've invested millions of dollars into ready assets, what is their exit? Who buys it from them? Strata sale is not the way. So the market is probably matured up. And I think in closer quarters of the government, there's a thought that is going on that we must free up commercial real estate from residential real estate. Because why we put fetters on foreign investment into residential real estate is speculative land trading. But when you're coming in a commercial real estate market, you're not coming in for land trading or speculative activities. You're running a business, right? Just like you're running a hotel, you're running a warehouse, you're running a business. So there was a thought that it should be allowed, these kind of asset classes where you take business risk must be monetized. And I think the other most important part was that there was a requirement, Indian capital markets, if you need to encourage, there needs to be depth. And they have been dormant for a while. And we believe that from REITs, if they take off, there should be some amount of depth that may come into the, into the Indian capital market. And then, of course, there were a spate of reasons beyond this that REITs would lead to better kind of real estate quality, because REITs would typically reinvest money, enhance yield in the project, so the REIT-owned projects are typically better and all of that. So, but these 4 or 5 are largely the broader reasons why there was an inherent urgency in the MOF. And today, real estate is the largest, real estate infra, the largest absorbers for foreign investment. If we need foreign investment, we need to provide adequate investment opportunities. And foreign investors, as we've seen, and we've seen the stories of India Bulls here, which was not that successful, was because we threw in developmental assets there. It's the developmental assets which spoil the story. And I think for many of these kind of players who are here in Singapore, wherever, the interest in India is probably there, but there is not much interest in developmental assets. The interest is only in core assets or yield generating assets. And where is that opportunity? REITs are intended to provide that kind of opportunity. And that's why the focus to tap that kind of foreign capital, large foreign capital base.
Thanks for that background, Ruchir. And I think just to add a point, I was looking at the FDI statistics that the Government of India published for this quarter. And if you look at the sectors that receive the maximum foreign investment, number 1 has always been the services sector, but number 2 is construction, development, and real estate. So just adding to what you said, it's the second largest recipient of foreign money. And therefore, I think the more avenues available for foreign investors to invest in efficient manner in Indian real estate, obviously it's going to be positive for everyone, for the country, for all the stakeholders involved. But it's so new and it's draft regulations. And so Kwong Weng, maybe you can, Singapore is a much more mature REIT market. You manage, I guess, 4 REITs which are listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. You also invest in India in development assets. Can you give us some background of how the REIT regime has developed in Singapore and your thoughts on what maybe India should be doing?
Sure. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you for having me on the panel. I think very quickly and briefly, the first and foremost key point of the Singapore REIT regime is that it has a very attractive tax status or tax treatment. So if you were to look at the update that Nishit Desai Associates has put up on the draft SEBI regulations for REIT, you would be able to see that whilst this is in its 3rd draft, there is still some uncertainty as regards the tax treatment. And when you look at the tax treatment, in Singapore especially, you would see that the Singapore regime has accorded a very favorable tax treatment on a few aspects. Firstly, on acquisition. In other words, when a Singapore REIT does an acquisition of local assets, there is a stamp duty exemption. So I think this gives a lot of impetus for buyers, as well as for the way in which the transaction is being structured, since stamp duty is exempted. Second, we all know that the first REIT in Singapore started more than 10 years ago, and today, thanks to the promotion by MAS as well as our SGX friends who are right beside me just now, the REIT market in Singapore has flourished to the extent that we have a very big market. In fact, if you have read the Asia Wall Street Journal today, there is an interesting article on the front page today on the REIT and as well as the business trust market, But be that as it may, it comes to my second point that the tax regime is also favorable for foreign income in the sense that there is a relief on foreign source income. And although this kind of tax relief, whether for stamp duty or for foreign source income, are subject to a sunset clause, but often than not, these reliefs are extended when the sunset clause comes into its last days. So whilst the REIT market is watching in some anticipation in Singapore in relation to foreign source income, which seems to have some uncertainty by the time it comes to 31st March 2015, but I think this twin focus of stamp duty exemption as well as relief from foreign source income has driven the REIT market in Singapore to a different dimension or a different paradigm. Of course, that's from the angle of a REIT player. In other words, whether you are a REIT sponsor or you are an independent REIT player. But from the perspective of a REIT investor, whether you are a corporate unit holder or an individual unit holder, you may also be aware that the tax regime for unit holders are also very favorable because there's a direct tax pass-through. In fact, for individual REIT unit holders, you have a complete exemption from income tax. So that creates a very favorable environment. For qualified institutional investors, you are only required to pay tax at a reduced rate of 10%. So again, from the perspective of a unit holder of a Singapore REIT, you are therefore given these two very attractive impetus that you should invest. But I think besides the tax angle, from both the perspective of the acquirer as well as the unit holder, I think it remains to be said that the perception of the Singapore tax regime as well as the REIT regime has taken on a different shine because if you compare it, say, with the Hong Kong REIT regime, we have grown by leaps and bounds, largely because the perception is that the Singapore REITs tend to be a congregation of very choice assets compared to the fact that in some other markets, and I dare say even in the Malaysian markets or to some commentators who have said that even in the Hong Kong markets, the not so good assets are often packaged into a REIT to be sold, and the choice assets are then left in the stable of the landowners. So I think on that few factors, it has driven the Singapore market to a very intensive, and a very interesting market to attract capital in terms of investors, in terms of fund managers from the REIT industry, as well as from the perspective of retail investors.
Thanks a lot, Kwong Wing. I think that's very helpful for all of us to know because we are just about to start understanding REITs and how we'll start using them in India. And maybe Shobit, this is a good time for your expertise. You heard Kwong Wing and you're also familiar with the REIT environment in other countries. Do you think this is a game changer for India? Have you started seeing interest? Are people calling you up?
I definitely believe this will be a game changer at some point. If you just study the REITs, I'm not even talking globally, just around Asia, they're about $300 billion in market cap. We have not even started. India is the call center of the world. We have 370 million square feet of grade A office space. We have 50% of our occupiers are US multinationals, probably Fortune 500 companies. How can you not allow retail participation or deepening of this market? You have to create institutional assets. So there is, in my mind, there's no doubt that this is a game changer and this has to be sort of given way to. I think we've been holding back way too long. So in my mind, this is going to change the game, and it's a win-win for the investors and the manufacturers of these assets. So I think in 2005 when they allowed FDI, I think, and 2008 they attempted to do REITs. I think probably there wasn't enough quality assets. Today, people like Ascendas, Mapletree, DLF, Blackstones, they've all helped in creating that bucket. it's probably time to now sort of allow people to come in. I know there are tax inefficiencies in the drafts that have come out, but that's not worrying me too much because, if government has moved this much, my guess is that they will take the next step when they see a reciprocating gesture from the developers or holders of these assets to say, okay, fine, you moved, let's attempt to move in there. My worry today is on how the markets are going to value it, right? Let us assume that the tax is clear. You also have stamp duty exemption. I mean, it's too much to ask in India, but I guess just to put it in perspective, let's get it there. How does it construct, right? I guess for foreign investors to come in, Indian investors have to come in, then the cap rates have to be more than the government securities, right, which is at 8% in India. So really, on private side, we are trading these assets at about 10 to 11%. We've been involved in some of the best transactions in India on institutional trades. Now, developers don't want to, if 10 is the market at the private side, they're not going to sort of list it at 10. It has to be much below that. And then there are leakages of managers and things like that. So really, I think the challenge in our mind or in my mind is to construct the total returns that the investors are looking for. And tax is a smaller part, but my guess is that will get resolved. And maybe going forward, we can debate this a little bit more. But I'm going to leave it to you guys to discuss the tax first and then come back again to the commercial.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Shobhit. I think that's so overall you're positive. You have some concerns on how it's going to be valued and the construct, and assuming that tax and stamp duty works itself out in some form or the other. Maybe quickly, Deepak, very briefly, if you could just tell us some of the key parameters of these regulations. We have talked about REITs, and we don't want to go into too much detail because that information will be available to you in our newsletters, but some important aspects of these draft regulations.
Sure. So, like Richard mentioned, this is the third attempt by SEBI to introduce REITs. So this time, the good thing is a lot of thought process has gone into the drafting of the REIT regulations. SEBI has clearly elucidated the parties who will be involved in the REIT, their roles, their responsibilities, and investor protection rights have also been incorporated in the REIT regulations. So just quickly, the REIT has been proposed to be set up as a trust. It cannot be a company or a partnership or a body corporate. It has to be set up as a trust. The units of the REITs have to be listed. So that's how the REIT structure is going to work. Now, in terms of parties, so I'll be just discussing the parties to the REIT, how the REIT can raise money, where all it can invest, and few investor protection rights. Now, parties to the REIT would be your sponsor. He will be the one who will be typically throwing the assets into the REIT pool. So there are certain conditions which the sponsor has to constantly maintain. For instance, he has to ensure that at least 15% of the REIT assets or REIT units have to be held by the sponsor to ensure skin in the game. That's about sponsor. Now, next is the trustee. Trustee is the person who will be holding the assets in his name for the benefit of the unit holders, again. So for trustees, there are a couple of onerous obligations, but yeah, since the draft REIT regulations, the final REIT regulations are yet to come out, those creases might iron out. For instance, it has been in the draft REIT regulations contemplate that trustees have to ensure that the real estate title is clear and proper. Now, the good thing is, unlike the previous REMF regulations, which provided that the REIT property, there should be no litigation on the REIT property. And as you may be aware that there are hardly any properties in India which do not have litigations. But here in this draft REIT regulations, they have provided that so long as you disclose it, it is fine. So trustee, and again, so trustee is going to supervise the manager, and he is going to be interface for the unit holders. Then third is the manager. Manager is going to play the most important role. He is going to make all the investment decisions as to where to invest the REIT assets and where to invest the REIT monies. He is going to manage the property, and he is going to run the entire IPO process. And he has to ensure that the valuation has to be done on a half-yearly basis. Now again, unlike REMF, the earlier mutual fund regulations, where the regulations provided that the NAV or the valuation has to be done on a daily basis. Now, for real estate, to find out the valuation on a daily basis is going to be almost impossible. So here they have provided the mechanism that on a half-yearly basis, the valuer has to determine the value, and within 15 days thereon, they just the NAV should be decided. So that's about the manager, and then the valuer. Again, valuer, a lot of importance has been given because REIT just holds the assets. So for valuer, there are certain stringent guidelines as minimum number of years experience, and they're also provided a construct of two valuers. One is the principal valuer, the secondary valuer, and in certain cases you take the average of the two. So these are the parties to the REIT. Now in terms of raising money, the REIT, the first go, they have to raise money through an IPO process. At least 250 crores has to be offered to the public, and public shareholding or public unit holding should not fall below 25%. That is the idea. And then going forward, the REIT can also raise money through rights issue or a QIP. So that's how the REIT is going to raise money. Now in terms of unit holding also, the public holding should not fall below 20 unit holders. So at least 20 unit holders have to hold the REIT units throughout. Now in terms of investment, the REIT regulations clearly provide that REIT can hold assets directly, or it can also hold the assets through an SPV. So if it is holding an assets through an SPV, it has to ensure that at least 50% of the shares are held by the REITs. And the remaining other shareholder, he doesn't have any rights which can obstruct or which can prevent the REIT from fulfilling its obligations under the REIT regulations. And in terms of investment, at least 80% of the REIT value has to be invested in completed and range rating asset, which means that at least 75%, so that has also been defined, at least 75% of the leasable area in that property has to be leased out. That is when it qualifies as a rent generating asset. So this is where, and also now the latest board meeting, they've given the final approval for REIT regulations. They have introduced some few other criteria that REIT earlier, they could, as per the draft regulations, they could invest only in one property. Now the board meeting has provided that the REIT has to invest at least in two properties. So they have ensured that there is no single unit, single asset REIT. It has to have at least two assets. And again, each asset should not be more than 60% of the total value. So it can't be just one small flat or one small commercial property. It has to be a substantial asset. So that is the in terms of the conditions in terms of investment. Then the regulations also provide various investor protection mechanisms. For instance, for certain related party transactions, they have provided thresholds beyond which the unit holder approval has to be taken. In certain cases, 50%, certain cases, 75%. Certain cases, they have also imposed the approval on the number of unit holders. So that, so that provides the protection to the investors. So that, and also most important, for instance, buying and selling of property, there they have clearly provided that if you're buying and selling property, you take the value average of the two. And then if you're buying, it should not be above the average. If you're selling, it should not be below the average. So those kind of protections have been built in terms of investor protection. And last is the delisting. Since the units of the REIT have to be listed throughout, if the number of units fell below 20 or unit holders fell below 20 or there are certain other conditions, then the units of the REIT have to be delisted and again the property has to be disposed and the proceeds have to be repatriated. And also just one last point, unlike Singapore REITs, where the proceeds or the lease rentals have to be upstreamed only to get the tax benefits, under the draft regulations, at least 90% of the net lease rentals have to be upstreamed just to qualify as a REIT under the Indian regulations. So the lease rentals have to be constantly upstreamed to the unit holders on a half-yearly basis.
Kwang Weng, is it very different from what you have here? Some of the things that Deepak mentioned, or are there some similarities in the regulatory framework?
Sure. Thanks, Deepak, for those rendition of the key points of the draft regulations. Well, it's largely similar. Of course, there are some nuances and some minor changes, but it really remains to be seen how this will take off, especially with what Sobit has talked about on the valuation and the investor perception.
Thanks. Maybe Nischal, from structuring perspective, and I think Shobit and others also mentioned about the tax issues that appear to be in the draft regulations. So how would you go about advising the government, firstly, I suppose, on what the tax framework for a REIT should be, and then how would you structure it?
Sure. So as all of you can see the structure diagram,
Currently, the sponsor can transfer the REIT assets in two ways. One is a direct transfer of the REIT asset, which is where the REIT is directly holding the asset. And the second structure is that there is already an SPV which is holding the asset, and the sponsor transfers the shares of the SPV to the REIT. So the REIT will hold the shares of SPV and the SPV will hold the REIT asset. Now, for any REIT regime to be successful, it's very important that we marry the sponsor taxation and the unit holder taxation. Only if both the sponsor and the unit holder taxation are efficient, then only the REIT regime could be successful. Obviously, as Shobit mentioned that, tax may be a small part, but it again depends on what is the gross return, because if tax is a substantial part of gross return, which itself is a smaller number, then it may not be tax efficient for the unit holders. So what the government has proposed right now is, if we first take the sponsor taxation, government has said that if a sponsor transfers the shares of an SPV which is holding the REIT asset, then there will not be any capital gain at the time of transfer of the REIT asset or transfer of the shares of the SPV to the REIT at the time of transfer of the asset. So what government has said, we will not tax you at the time of transfer of the REIT asset, but what we will do is that the REIT units which you get against transfer of the REIT assets or the shares of the SPV to the REIT, when you actually transfer those units in future on the exchange, we will tax you at that point in time. So one of the concerns with the sponsor community has been having is that, let's say you are transferring a $100 asset at $200 to REIT. At that time, ideally, you would have paid $100 of capital gains to the government. What government is saying that I will not tax you at that time, but when your $200, in case it becomes, let's say, $300, I will tax you on $300 minus $100, which was the original cost of acquisition of your REIT shares of the SPV. So I'll tax you on the $200. Now, one of the concerns which the sponsor community, as I mentioned, is having is that for all other unit holders, when they transfer units on the floor of the exchange, they are not taxed. So what they are saying is that, why are you taxing us for the gain from 200 to 300? Because that is something which you are anyways not taxing the other unit holders. So that's a major concern which the sponsors are facing. Second concern which they have is, government has not provided any tax exemption for a sponsor to directly transfer the REIT asset into the REIT. So only exemption which is there currently is if you are transferring the shares of SPV, but if you are directly transferring the asset, there is no exemption which has been provided. So that's on the sponsor taxation. Let's come to the unit holder taxation. Now for unit holder taxation, it's important to understand how the REIT would get taxed. Typically there will be three streams of income from, in case we are following the SPV structure, where if there is no debt in the structure, the SPV will pay a 30% corporate tax on the lease rentals that it receives. When the SPV upstreams cash to the REIT, there will be a dividend distribution tax of 17% which the SPV will pay. The REIT will be exempt from tax, and so would be the unit holder. So overall, if there is no debt in the structure, you will end up paying about 40 to 43% tax on the REIT structure. But one of the things which SEBI has also provided is that you can leverage up to 49% of your total REIT assets. So to that extent, if you are able to build the debt component in the structure, then there is a way in which you can pretty much achieve a tax pass-through for the entire structure. Obviously, the unit holders will still have to pay tax. So let's say if we are able to interpose debt into the structure, and once we interpose the debt, what will happen is we'll be able to wipe out the taxable income in the form of lease rentals with the interest which the SPV pays to the REIT. So SPV doesn't pay any tax. On interest, there is no dividend, there is no distribution tax. The REIT is also tax exempt. The only tax that is imposed on interest is 5% withholding tax for non-residents and 10% withholding tax for Indian residents. Now here it is where for Indian resident, it's not the most tax efficient structure, because Indian residents still have to pay additional 20% tax because their basic tax rate is 30%. But this structure becomes very important for non-resident investors. Because if you're coming from a jurisdiction where anyways the interest income is getting taxed, and in that jurisdiction the Indian trust is considered as a pass-through, then the 5% withholding tax which is paid in India will be available as a credit in the local jurisdiction. If that happens, then pretty much for the non-resident holder, the entire structure is a tax pass-through, because there is no foreign tax that they are paying. The only tax that they are paying is a tax in their own jurisdiction. So with this debt structure, if it is possible to achieve a tax pass-through for the entire structure, obviously there are still more demands from the sponsor and the developer and the fund management community, that there should not be any dividend distribution tax in case we are using an equity structure, because they are comparing it with a listed company model. Let's say a developer is having a listed company which is owning commercial assets. For those listed companies, it is not mandatory to distribute dividend. It is at the board's discretion on whether it wants to distribute dividend or not. As compared to that, in case of a REIT, SEBI has mandated that at least 90% of the net distributable cash flows of the REIT have to be mandatorily distributed to the unit holders. And because it's mandatory, they have to also pay dividend distribution tax. So there are proposals which have been made to the government to further relax some of these tax proposals. But the way I look at it is, even if these tax proposals are kept in the same form, there are still structures which could be worked out to make the entire structure pass through.
I think that's very interesting, because as we heard in the first panel, debt, we discussed a lot about debt. Debt seems to be finding its way into a REIT structure as well, as far as achieving some sort of a tax pass-through, at least at the REIT level. And the other good thing, I think, is that this government at least has given the signs that it's willing to listen to people and take everyone's views when finalizing regulations. So whilst we may not get all the tax benefits that one is seeking, it's a more engaged government. It's a more online government. So all of us and all our peers have been contributing a lot of advice to the government and recommendations. And finally, of course, I think one will wait and see what form these final regulations take. Maybe quickly, I think we have 15 minutes before the session ends, but Kwang Wing, I would like to ask you and then wrap up with Shobit. I think audience has heard the lawyers more now. I know you're also a lawyer, but you're in-house, so it's different. What would drive investors to invest in Indian REITs? If I was to ask you, if you were an investor, what would drive you to do it?
Well, if you ask any investor, I think the first and foremost question that comes to mind is, what is my return? So at the end of the day, the return versus, say, the risk-free rate, would it be an attractive hurdle for me to cross, and how certain is that hurdle? So in the same way, if you look at it from the Singapore REIT regime, where just like the draft regulations that SEBI has passed out, where every REIT is legally mandated to pay out 90% of its net distributable income, I think that will go a long way to assure the investors that you have a steady stream compared to other investment products or structures, or even for that matter, compared to a business trust in Singapore. So I think that the return, or the perception of the security of the return, will be something that is very fundamental. Of course, then it goes back to Shobit's point about what is the certainty or the differential towards the return versus the risk-free rate, as I mentioned. So I think that is a question of valuation, but at the same time, we all know, as we can hear earlier, that valuation oftentimes is driven by the underlying taxation structure and also the underlying tax structure. In Singapore, a REIT can leverage up to 60, especially if it's rated. So in the same way, if the correct structure, including the debt structure and the capital structure, is put in place, then it will go a long way to drive the certainty of the return. Finally, I think it goes back to a very fundamental point that what are the safeguards if the REIT product turns sour? In other words, what are the investor protection features that the REIT has contained? So I think for the Singapore regime, the gold or the platinum standard that we heard about from MAS and from SGX has gone a long way to assure investors that there's no concentration risk or single asset risk, the kind of risk that we talked about earlier, compared to the Indian regulations. That although in the detailed comparisons you don't have a provision in the Singapore REIT regimes that require about what we talk about, that the asset has been 75% leased out and all that. But there are other requirements, such as the development limit is only restricted to 10% of the REIT NAV. So as a result, all this gives a different kind of glow and a different kind of protection whenever a potential investor looks at the investment product.
Shobit, finally to you before we go to the audience for questions. Your final thoughts, what would you look for? You've mentioned valuation and some of those issues. But why don't you give us some of your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, interesting that we talk about investor protection and unit holder protection. I think this time around the Securities and Exchange Board has been very mindful, and I think they've done more than what they would have usually done in the first draft itself. So I think they've taken the best features in my mind. There may be some improvements that could be done, but that's separate. I'm not worried about investor protection. I think what we are seeing when we are doing deals on the private side is that the investors are looking at total returns of sort of mid-teens. Currently, the way it's constituted is about 10-11% is coming from income, and about 4-5% is what they're looking at from appreciation or capital gains. My guess is going forward on the REITs, if they were to, they have to, my guess is they have to compete with this and they have to deliver this kind of return. We'll have to sort of re-educate the investors to say, you'll perhaps get sub 8% as income. You have to be very, very mindful of the fact that we are in an inflationary environment. The way we write our leases have built-in rent escalations. You will make about 3-4% from appreciation on rent, and then you have a capital gains sort of piece, which is the total. When you exit, you make some profit. So my guess is that any investor will look at total returns of mid-teens, and instead of 2, he probably has 3 legs to cover. But I think the product will offer, I think it's a good product, and I'm hoping we'll see it. Investors are hoping they'll see it. So let's see how it works.
Thanks. I think we end on a positive note, and hopefully everyone gets what they seek in the new REIT regime. Let's open the floor for questions, and then we'll move to the people who've dialed in, and then of course we'll go out and have some tea. Any questions? Mr. Menon?
In the proposed regulations, who will appoint the principal valuer and the secondary valuer, and to whom will they be accountable to?
So the valuer appointment can be done. The valuer appointment can be done by the issuer. Accountability they will be accountable ultimately to the SEBI, because that's the overarching body. But the way the valuation norms are today, it has to be, the valuer has to value as per the international accepted methodologies or the ICAI or the chartered accountant prescribed methodology, and the chartered accountant methodology kind of prevails over anything else. So the way I look at it, I think you would see more of chartered accountants doing this kind of valuations, and therefore they would be accountable to CA Institute number 1, and of course at the overarching level to the SEBI from an investor grievance perspective, something goes wrong.
Yeah, also just to add, what has been mentioned in the draft REIT regulation is that the valuers will have to qualify the criteria under the New Companies Act of 2013. Now, under the New Companies Act, there is this concept of registered valuer, and there are stringent penalties on the registered valuers if they don't comply with their duties under the Companies Act. So if there is any problem which happens on account of the registered valuer, not only SEBI, not only ICAI, but the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is the body which is going to also regulate these valuers. And on top of that, under the new Companies Act, there is this concept of class action suits, which has been introduced in India, which has never been there in India in the past. And as we know, in developed jurisdiction, this is quite a common thing. So under the class action suit also, you can sue the valuer in a situation where they have done things in a wrongful way or with a malified intent. So it's not easy for the valuer to value the property in the way they want, because there are a lot of daggers on their head which are there.
Coming, can I just ask you, does that appear to be more stringent than what we have in Singapore?
Well, I think those of you who are involved in the REIT industry in Singapore knows that the only time that you require two valuations is when you do a RPT, which is a related party transaction. And it depends on how chummy, if I may dare say, the trustee is. Sometimes the trustee leave you to get the job done, so long as there's a sign-off by the two valuers, beg your pardon. Yes, in that broad strokes, yes, it sounds like there's a lot more accountability. But although I have shared with you the chummy part of the stories, but let me assure you that the trustees are not sleeping on their job. They are still very vigilant, and they ask questions. They ask about cap rates. They ask about comparables. They ask about the DCF for RPTs. So whilst we may not require the kind of registered valuer concept in Singapore as yet, but I think the process is equally rigorous. And I think this augurs well that India is starting on perhaps a more stringent or strict footing.
Actually, I was thinking of at the start of an acquisition of an asset by the REIT.
I'm sorry what Shobhit mentioned about perception. I'm sorry to share this thought with you is perception is negative. And I'll tell you why. He mentioned that we can sue the valuer, but by the time you get a judgment, it'll be about 15 years. So that perception is what is deterring people to invest in this particular kind of a product. Securities, totally different. I mean, it's a time tested, our stock exchange is there for about 150, 80 years, or I don't know. So there is a system in place, and there is a investor protection which is time tested, whereas in REIT, perception is
Maybe I'll just
negative. 1 minute. One more thing I want to ask you is, you mentioned that the rental return on REIT is about 10%, and you're allowed to leverage around 50%, as I understand on the REIT. Are you saying that the gross rental yield, as investment guys say, is around 7% on commercial and residential property? Because you said 10% on rental and 5% on capital appreciation. So to get a 10% rental yield means your gross return has to be at least 6-7% on residential and commercial property.
What we are saying is that currently the cap rate is 10%. When you distribute that, there may be some losses, and that is why I think what REIT talks about is distributable surplus, and therefore there's a leakage of about 2-3% in that. You want?
Yeah, no, I was just about to say that it is this, to allay these kind of fears, that who will the valuer be accountable to, this is a very impractical valuation standard that the SEBI has prescribed. A chartered accountant, to that extent, may not be able to value the property as well as a property consultant like JL or someone, because it's very localized, But the challenge that we were involved with SEBI in many these kind of discussions while these regulations were drafted. SEBI said that, I want someone whose neck I can catch. Now, I want somebody which is regulated. And, merchant bankers can't value this, so, okay, so what do? Then I will catch Chartered Account Institute. And the Chartered Account Institute does not even have prescribed methodologies for these kind of real estate, and how will this happen? So, it is this fear or this apprehension which is actually driving things to a little bit of, impractical way. So, that was just my thought.
Yeah, and just I think as everything, it takes time. You yourself mentioned about the stock markets. No one fears investing in the Indian stock market. I think give it time, and once it matures, we'll probably see this market develop as well. Any more questions from the audience? Yes.
Perhaps just to add to that, if you were to rewind back the Singapore REIT history, you may or may not realize that the first REIT actually failed in its IPO. Yeah, so I mean, everything takes time. I agree with you that it depends on where you start your baseline on the perception. But be that as it may, I think there are different strokes for different folks. If you are looking for a yield play, you may think that you know, a REIT is good. If you are looking for capital appreciation, the yield may be a bit too slow. If you are looking for a leverage product, you know, the yield may be a hybrid. I'm not sure, but at the end of the day, all I'm trying to say is that you know, the Singapore REIT industry has also taken time in order to reach where it is today.
Yeah, my question is to Deepak. You mentioned the different entities into the REIT structure. So particularly the investors, the sponsor, the manager. Is there any element of an offshore sort of entity or something which can take a play, or it's all simply onshore in terms of the entities defined?
Yeah, so the draft REIT regulations in terms of sponsor and manager, it can be anyone. The draft REIT regulations provide that investors can be both residents as well as non-residents. The only thing is, because REIT will be investing in completed assets, which are you know, core assets. So to that extent, the RBI, which is the exchange control regulator, they will have to provide, or they have to just tweak the, you know, the exchange control regulations to provide for non-residents to invest in core assets. But that also, I think, in principle approval, they have already given. The regulations are yet to be amended for that.
Should we go to the questions? If anyone has a question on who's dialed in, Karuna, if you're still there. So I think that brings us to the end of our panel discussion. Thanks, Kwong Weng. Thanks, Shobit, for all your insights, very valuable, and hope to see the REIT regime develop the way in which we all want it to. And thank you all for coming, but please stay with us for tea. We'll see you all outside. Thank you.